I should have walked away the moment I saw him, because nothing good ever waits in the rain at 2:17 a.m., especially not a man bleeding in the middle of an empty parking lot. But I didn't move, not when the cold soaked through my scrubs, not when my hands started to shake, not even when every instinct I had told me this wasn't just another patient. This wasn't a car accident or a late-night overdose or someone who needed stitches and paperwork. This was something else, something quieter and heavier, like the air right before a storm breaks. And I remember thinking how strange it was that the world could feel so still while my heart was pounding so loud it almost drowned out the sound of the rain hitting the pavement. Sharp and steady like a warning I chose to ignore, because he was there, leaning against the side of a black SUV that looked too expensive for this part of the city, his shirt darkened from the rain. One hand pressed against his side like he was holding something together that didn't want to stay. And when he looked up at me, really looked, I felt it. That shift, like I had stepped into a story that wasn't mine to tell. His eyes weren't desperate, not like the patience I was used to. They were controlled, focused, like he was measuring me, calculating something I couldn't understand. And that should have been enough to make me turn around, get in my car, and drive the 15 minutes home to my tiny apartment where the heat barely worked and the coffee always tasted burnt. But instead I took a step closer, then another, until I was standing right in front of him, close enough to see the way his jaw tightened when he moved, close enough to notice that he didn't ask for help, didn't say a word, just watched me like he was waiting to see what kind of person I was going to be. And I hated that question. Hated that it was suddenly mine to answer. Because kindness is easy when it's safe, when there are bright lights and other people around and rules to follow. But out here, with no one watching and no one to call, kindness felt like a risk, like stepping off something high without knowing if there was ground beneath. And I hesitated, just for a second, just long enough to imagine what would happen if I walked away, how simple it would be, how normal my life would stay, how none of this would follow me. But then he shifted, just slightly, and I saw it. The way his hand trembled before he stilled it again, like weakness was something he refused to show. And that was it. That was the moment everything changed, because I moved without thinking, dropping my bag onto the wet concrete and kneeling in front of him, my fingers already working, already searching for something I could fix, something I could control. "You need to sit down," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. And for a second, I thought he might refuse, might push me away, might disappear back into whatever world he came from. But instead he let out a slow breath and lowered himself into the driver's seat, never taking his eyes off me. And when I reached for his hand to move it aside, he didn't pull away, just watched, silent, intense. Like this was the first time anyone had ever touched him without asking for something in return. And I told myself it didn't matter who he was, didn't matter why he was here, didn't matter that something about him felt dangerous in a way I couldn't explain, because in that moment, he was just a man who needed help, and I was the kind of person who couldn't walk away, even when I knew I should. Even when a voice in the back of my mind whispered that some choices don't just change your night. They change everything that comes after, and I didn't know it yet, didn't understand the weight of what I had just done. But later, much later, I would look back on that exact moment, on the rain, on his eyes, on the way my hands didn't stop shaking until long after it was over, and I would realize that kindness isn't free. It never was. It always costs something. And that night, without even knowing his name, I had just agreed to pay the price. His hand was colder than I expected, not weak, just controlled. Like every movement he made was deliberate, even the way he let me guide him without resistance, and that unsettled me more than if he had pushed me away, because people who are used to being helped usually ask for it. They show it in their voice, in their posture, in the way they look at you like you are their last option. But he did not look at me like that. He looked at me like I was an interruption he had not planned for, and somehow that made me more determined to stay, to finish what I had started, to prove that this moment was not about him or whatever world he came from. It was about the choice I had already made. "Stay still," I said quietly, my fingers moving with practiced precision as I checked him over, ignoring the way his gaze followed every motion, the way it lingered just a second too long, as if memorizing something. And I told myself it did not matter, that I had done this 100 times before, that people looked at nurses like that when they were in pain or confused or afraid, except he was none of those things. And that realization sat heavy in my chest as I worked, the rain still falling around us, steady and relentless, soaking through my clothes until I could not tell where the cold ended and the tension began. "You should be at a hospital," I added, more to fill the silence than because I expected him to listen, and for a moment, he said nothing, just watched me like he was deciding something, weighing options I could not see. And then finally, his voice came, low and even. "No." Just that, one word. No explanation, no hesitation, like it was not a suggestion but a fact, and something in me wanted to argue, to insist, to remind him that there were protocols and rules and safer choices than this. But the way he said it stopped me, not out of fear exactly, but because it felt pointless, like arguing with gravity, and I realized then that whatever had brought him here, whatever had put him in front of me tonight, it was not something that could be solved with paperwork and fluorescent lights. And that should have been my second warning, but instead I just nodded, slightly, and adjusted what I could, doing what I was trained to do, focusing on the small things, the details I could control, the rhythm of my breathing, the steadiness of my hands, because that was easier than thinking about the bigger picture, easier than asking questions I was not sure I wanted answered. And when I finally leaned back, finished with what little I could do in a parking lot at 2 in the morning, I expected him to look away, to dismiss me, to retreat back into that quiet distance he carried around him like armor, but he did not. He just kept looking at me, and there was something different in his expression now, not softer, not warmer, just changed, like I had altered something without meaning to. "Why did you stop?" he asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the sound of the rain, and I blinked, caught off guard. "What?" I said, and he held my gaze, unblinking. "You hesitated," he said, not accusing, just stating it like he had been watching from the very beginning, like he had seen every second. I thought no one noticed, and my chest tightened at that, because he was right, because for a moment I had almost walked away, and I did not know how to explain that without sounding weak or afraid, both things I hated admitting, so I shrugged slightly, trying to make it smaller than it felt. "People hesitate," I said, my voice quieter now, more honest than I intended. "It does not mean anything." And for the first time since I met him, something shifted in his expression, subtle but unmistakable, like he did not agree, like to him that moment meant everything, and he leaned back slightly, studying me in a way that made the air feel heavier, more charged. "It does," he said after a pause, his voice softer now, but no less certain. "Most people choose fear." And I swallowed, the words settling somewhere deep, because I knew he was right, because I had almost chosen it too. And I did not know what it said about me that I had not, that I was still here, kneeling in the rain next to a man I did not know, in a situation that made no sense, and yet felt like it mattered more than anything else I had done all night. "Maybe," I said finally, meeting his eyes without looking away this time, but I did not, and the silence that followed was different, not empty, not uncomfortable, just full, like something invisible had shifted between us, something I could not name yet. And he held my gaze for a long moment before giving a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if confirming something to himself, as if I had just answered a question he had been asking for a long time. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet certainty that sent a strange chill down my spine, not from fear, but from something I could not quite place. "No," he said, watching me like he had already decided. "Something I had not agreed to yet. You did not." The sound came before the headlights, low and smooth, cutting through the rain like something that did not belong in a place like this, and I felt it more than heard it, that subtle shift in the air that made my instincts tighten before my mind could catch up. His eyes moved first, not toward me but past me, over my shoulder, focused and sharp in a way that instantly changed everything about him, like whatever quiet moment we had just shared was already over, replaced by something colder, something controlled. And I turned without thinking, my pulse quickening as a second black car pulled into the lot, then a third, their engines idling in perfect sync, headlights reflecting off the wet pavement in long streaks of white and gold. And for a second, I just stood there, trying to understand what I was seeing, because this was not normal, none of this was normal, and yet the way he exhaled slowly behind me, the way his posture shifted just slightly, told me that for him, this was routine, expected. Like this was the world he lived in every day, and I felt it then, that invisible line I had stepped over without realizing. the one that separates ordinary from something else entirely. And before I could say anything, the doors opened, one by one, quiet and precise, and men stepped out, dressed in dark coats that fit too well to be accidental. Their movements calm, measured, not rushed or panicked, just efficient, like they already knew exactly what they were walking into. And my chest tightened as they approached, not threatening, not aggressive, just certain, like they had every right to be here, like this space belonged to them. Now, and I took a small step back without meaning to, my hand instinctively tightening around the strap of my bag, suddenly aware of how out of place I was, how unprepared I was for whatever this was becoming. And then one of them spoke, his voice respectful but direct. "Sir, just that." And I froze, because I felt it before I understood it. That shift in power, the way the word landed between us, not casual, not polite, but absolute. And slowly, almost reluctantly, I turned back to him, and the man I had been kneeling beside just moments ago was gone, replaced by someone else entirely, someone who did not lean or hesitate or question, someone who simply existed with a kind of quiet authority that made everything around him adjust accordingly. And he stood, steady now, as if whatever weakness I had seen before had been temporary, irrelevant, his gaze flicking to the men who had arrived before settling back on me. And for a brief second, just a second, something passed through his expression, something unreadable, like he was recalculating, like I was now part of a situation I did not understand. "You should leave," he said finally, his voice calm, but different now, more distant, like he had already stepped back into whatever role he held in this world. And I blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift, by the way the moment between us seemed to close without warning. "What is going on?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it, because I needed something to hold on to, some explanation that would make sense of what I was seeing. But he did not answer, just watched me again with that same steady intensity. And one of the men moved closer, not threatening, just present, like a reminder that I was no longer the only one standing here. "Miss, it is not safe for you to stay," he said, his tone careful, measured, like he was trying to guide me without pushing. And I should have listened. I should have taken that as my exit, as my chance to walk away before this became something bigger than I could handle. But instead I looked back at him, at the man who had asked me why I did not choose fear, and something in me refused to leave without understanding, without finishing what had started. "Are you going to be okay?" I asked quietly, the question feeling almost out of place now, small compared to everything else unfolding around us. And for a moment, the silence stretched, the rain filling the space between us, steady and unrelenting. And then he stepped closer, just enough that the others did not follow, just enough that it felt like the world narrowed again, like it was only the two of us for one last second. "I will be," he said, his voice lower now, more controlled, but there was something else beneath it, something I could not quite name, something that made my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear. And then, after a brief pause, his gaze held mine with a certainty that felt heavier than anything he had said before. "The question is whether you will be." And I did not understand what he meant, not fully, not yet, but the way he said it stayed with me, long after I finally stepped back, long after I turned toward my car, long after I told myself this was over, that I had done my part and could go back to my normal life. Because even then, even as I reached for the door handle with hands that still had not quite stopped shaking, I knew something had shifted in a way I could not undo. And for the first time that night, the thought crossed my mind, quiet but persistent, that maybe walking away had never really been an option at all. I drove home with the rain still clinging to the windshield like it did not want to let me go, the wipers moving in a steady rhythm that should have been calming but was not, because my mind kept replaying every second of what had just happened, the way his voice had changed, the way those men had looked at him, the way everything around him seemed to shift without him raising his voice or even trying. And I told myself it did not matter, that people had complicated lives, that not every strange moment meant something bigger, but the truth sat heavier than that, pressing against my thoughts no matter how hard I tried to push it away, because nothing about tonight had felt ordinary, not the silence, not the way he had looked at me, not the way he had said those last words like he already knew something I did not. And by the time I pulled into the parking lot outside my apartment building, my hands were still tight on the steering wheel, my fingers stiff from gripping something I could not see. I sat there for a moment longer than necessary, the engine idling, the dashboard clock glowing 2:43 a.m., and I tried to convince myself to let it go, to walk upstairs, change out of my wet clothes, and sleep like. This had been just another long shift that blurred into the next, but something in me would not settle, something restless and sharp that kept pulling me back to that moment, to his question, to the way he had watched me like I mattered in a way that did not make sense, and I hated that. Hated that a stranger could leave that kind of impression, that kind of weight. So I forced myself out of the car, grabbed my bag, and walked inside. The hallway quiet and dim, the hum of old fluorescent lights, filling the space as I climbed the stairs to my apartment, each step slower than the last, like part of me expected something to follow, something to interrupt the fragile normalcy I was trying to rebuild, but nothing did. Everything was still, familiar, safe, and that should have been enough. It should have grounded me, but instead it felt almost unreal, like I had stepped back into a version of my life that no longer fit the same way. And I did not understand why. I did not understand how one night, one choice, could shift something so deeply without anything obvious changing. I unlocked my door, stepped inside, and leaned against it for a second, closing my eyes, letting out a breath I had been holding since I left that parking lot. And I told myself again that it was over, that whatever world he belonged to was separate from mine, that people like him did not cross into lives like mine more than once, that I had done what I was supposed to do and nothing more. But even as I thought it, I knew it was not true, because something about the way he had looked at me, something about the certainty in his voice, had not felt temporary. It had felt like a beginning, like a line drawn in a place I could not see yet. And I pushed away from the door, dropped my bag onto the small kitchen table, and moved toward the sink, turning on the faucet just to hear something normal, something predictable, the sound of running water filling the silence, grounding me in something real. And that was when I noticed it, not at first, not until I turned around, my eyes catching on something that had not been there before, something out of place in the quiet stillness of my apartment, a small, clean envelope resting on the table beside my bag, untouched, perfectly dry, as if it had been placed there carefully, deliberately, and my chest tightened instantly, my pulse picking up in a way that felt all too familiar, because I knew, before I even stepped closer, before I even reached for it, that this was not random, this was not coincidence, this was not something I could explain away with logic or timing or simple mistake. And for a moment I just stood there, staring at it, the room suddenly feeling smaller, quieter, like the walls themselves were holding their breath, and slowly, almost reluctantly, I reached out, my fingers hovering for just a second before making contact. The paper cool beneath my skin, real, undeniable, and when I finally picked it up, my name written clearly across the front in precise, steady handwriting I had never seen before. I felt it again, that same shift, that same quiet certainty, that had followed me since the moment I chose not to walk away. And this time, there was no mistaking it. Whatever I had stepped into tonight had not ended in that parking lot. It had followed me home, and something told me it was not going to leave. I did not open it right away because something in me already knew that once I did, there would be no pretending this was coincidence anymore. No way to tell myself that tonight was just a strange detour that ended when I closed my apartment door. So I stood there in the dim light of my kitchen, the envelope in my hand, my name staring back at me like it belonged to someone else. Someone who made choices without thinking about consequences. Someone who stepped into things without looking for a way out. And my fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the paper as I tried to steady my breathing, tried to find something logical, something ordinary to hold on to. But there was nothing ordinary about this. Not the timing, not the placement, not the quiet certainty that settled in my chest as I finally slid my finger beneath the seal and opened it, slow and careful, like I was afraid of what I might find inside. And for a second, I thought it might be empty, just a message without words, something meant to unsettle more than explain. But then I pulled out a single card, thick, clean, the kind of paper that felt expensive without needing to prove it. And there were only a few words written on it, nothing dramatic, nothing threatening, just simple, precise, and somehow heavier than anything else that could have been said. You made the right choice. And I stared at it longer than I should have, my mind trying to process what that meant, how he could know where I lived, how he could have something placed here without me noticing, how quickly everything had shifted from a moment in the rain to something that followed me into my own space, my own life. And I felt that familiar tension rise again, that pull between walking away and leaning in, between fear and something else I was not ready to name, because part of me wanted to tear the card in half, throw it away, pretend I had never seen it. But another part of me, the same part that had stepped toward him instead of away, would not let me do that. It needed to understand, needed to know what this meant. And as I turned the card over, my breath caught slightly when I saw the second line, smaller, almost like an afterthought, but somehow more important than the first. I do not forget. And that was it. No name, no number, no explanation, just those words, sitting there like a promise I had not agreed to. And I let out a slow breath, my hand lowering slightly, as the weight of it settled in, because this was not gratitude, not in the way I understood it. This was something else, something quieter and more permanent, and I could feel it in the way my thoughts shifted, in the way my apartment no longer felt entirely like mine, like a boundary had been crossed without permission but not without intention. And I moved slowly to the table, setting the card down with more care than I meant to. As if it deserved respect, I had not decided to give it yet. And for a long moment, I just stood there, staring at it, trying to decide what to do next. Because ignoring it did not feel like an option anymore. Not when it was already here. Not when it had found me so easily. And that realization should have made me afraid. It should have pushed me to create distance, to protect myself in the way anyone else would. But instead it did something else entirely. Something quieter and far more dangerous. It made me curious. And I hated that. Hated that curiosity could feel stronger than caution, that understanding could feel more important than safety. And I dragged a hand through my still damp hair, turning away from the table as if distance would make it easier to think. But the words followed me anyway, repeating in my mind with a clarity I could not ignore. You made the right choice. And I did not know if that was reassurance or a warning. I did not know if it meant I had done something good or something irreversible. But I knew one thing with a certainty that settled deep in my chest as the night stretched on around me, quiet and unchanged in every way except the one that mattered most. This was not over, not even close, and whatever came next was already on its way. I did not sleep, not really, because every time I closed my eyes I saw the envelope again, sitting there like it belonged, like it had always been part of my apartment, and I had just never noticed until now. And the words kept replaying in my head with a clarity that felt almost deliberate, as if they were not meant to fade, not meant to be forgotten. And by the time the first light of morning slipped through the thin curtains, I was already awake, already sitting at the edge of my bed with the card still resting on the table across the room, exactly where I had left it, unchanged, and yet somehow heavier in the quiet of daylight. And I told myself that things would look different in the morning, that whatever had felt intense and unsettling in the middle of the night would shrink under normal light. But it did not. It stayed exactly the same, precise and intentional. And that made something in my chest tighten in a way I could not ignore, because it meant this was not a moment, not a passing interaction. This was something that had been decided, something that had already moved forward, without asking me if I wanted it to. And I stood slowly, my movements deliberate as I crossed the room and picked up the card again, my fingers brushing over the ink as if it might reveal something more, some hidden meaning I had missed the first time. But it did not. It just felt solid, real, and certain, and I exhaled quietly before setting it back down, turning away with more force than necessary, because staring at it was not going to give me answers. It was only going to pull me deeper into something I still did not understand. And I needed distance, needed normalcy, needed something that belonged to me and not to whatever this was becoming. So I grabbed my bag, changed quickly, and left for work earlier than usual, the cool morning air hitting my face as I stepped outside, grounding me in something simple and familiar, the sound of traffic, the rhythm of people moving through their routines, all of it steady and predictable in a way that felt almost reassuring. And for a few minutes, I let myself believe that I could still fit into this world the same way I always had, that last night could stay contained in memory instead of spilling into everything else. But that illusion did not last long. Not when I reached the hospital and pushed through the doors, the familiar scent of antiseptic and coffee wrapping around me like it always did. Not when I walked down the hallway toward the nurse's station and noticed the subtle shift in the way people looked at me. Not obvious, not dramatic, just a fraction longer than usual, a fraction more aware, like something had changed and they were trying to figure out what it was, and I frowned slightly, brushing it off as lack of sleep or imagination until I reached my locker, opened it, and froze, because there, resting neatly on the shelf where I kept my spare scrubs, was a small box, simple, matte black, with no label, no indication of where it came from or who had placed it there, and my pulse picked up instantly, sharp and immediate, because I knew, before I even touched it, before I even looked around to see if anyone was watching, that this was not random, that this was connected, that whatever line had been crossed last night had not stopped at my apartment door. It had followed me here, into the one place that was supposed to be separate, safe, untouched, and I glanced over my shoulder instinctively. But everything looked normal, nurses moving between rooms, monitors beeping softly in the distance, conversations blending into background noise. Nothing out of place except for the box sitting in front of me like it had every right to be there. And slowly, carefully, I reached out, my fingers hovering for just a second before lifting the lid, and inside, resting on dark fabric, was a phone, sleek and unfamiliar, powered off, silent, waiting, and my breath caught slightly as I stared at it, because this was no longer subtle, no longer something I could explain away as coincidence or curiosity. This was deliberate, direct, and for the first time since last night, a clear realization settled in my mind with a weight I could not ignore. This was not just about what I had done. This was about what he had decided, and I had a feeling that whatever came next was not going to be optional. I did not touch the phone right away because something about it felt too final, like the moment I turned it on, whatever distance I still had would disappear completely, and I stood there with the locker door open, my fingers resting lightly against the edge of the shelf as I tried to steady the sudden rush of thoughts that did not line up in any logical way, because this was not how normal things happened. People did not leave phones in lockers without explanation. They did not reach into your life this precisely without being seen. And yet here it was, solid and real, sitting where only I should have access. And that realization settled deeper than anything else, not loud, not dramatic, just certain. And I glanced over my shoulder again, slower this time, more deliberate, searching faces instead of movements. But no one was looking at me directly. No one was watching in a way I could catch. Everything continued as if nothing had changed, and that almost made it worse, because it meant whoever had done this did not need to be seen to be present. And I swallowed, forcing my hand forward until my fingers closed around the phone, lifting it carefully as if it might react. But it did not. It stayed dark, silent, waiting, and for a moment I considered leaving it there, closing the locker and walking away, pretending I had never found it, because ignoring it would be easier, safer, but the same quiet pull that had guided me last night did not let me. It never did. And I exhaled slowly before pressing the power button, the screen lighting up instantly, as if it had been waiting for that exact moment. And there was no lock screen, no password, just a single contact already open, a name displayed in clean, simple letters that made my chest tighten without warning, Adrian, and my breath caught slightly because seeing it written out, clear and undeniable, made everything feel more real than it had before, gave shape to something that had been just presence and voice and certainty until now. And I stared at it for a second longer than necessary before the phone vibrated softly in my hand. Not a call, not a message notification, just a subtle signal that something had changed, and then the screen shifted, a message appearing without me touching anything, precise and controlled, like everything else connected to him. You should not have come to work today, and my pulse jumped instantly, sharp and immediate, because that was not a suggestion, not a casual statement. It was something else entirely, something that made me look up again, faster this time, scanning the hallway beyond the locker room, suddenly aware of every sound, every movement, every person passing by, and I stepped out slowly, the phone still in my hand, my grip tightening around it as I tried to process what that meant, why he would say that, what he knew that I did not. And for a moment, everything felt suspended, like the world was holding its breath just before something shifted. And then it happened, not dramatic, not loud, just a small, subtle disruption in the rhythm of the morning, A conversation cutting off mid-sentence somewhere down the hall, a nurse pausing longer than necessary as she checked a chart, a quiet tension that spread without explanation, and I felt it before I understood it. That same invisible shift I had noticed the night before, the same quiet warning wrapped in stillness, and my heart started to beat faster, not from panic but from awareness, from the growing realization that this was not random. This was connected, all of it, the card, the phone, the message, and whatever was happening right now. It was unfolding with or without my understanding, and the phone vibrated again in my hand, pulling my focus back to the screen as a second message appeared, shorter this time, heavier, "Stay where you are." And something in the way those words landed made me stop moving completely, my body going still before my mind could catch up, because it was not just a request, it was certainty, like he already knew I would listen, like he had already decided what my next step would be, and I hated that, hated the way part of me responded to it without question, the way I found myself standing there, exactly where I was, the hallway stretching out in front of me, the normal world continuing just out of reach. And for the first time since all of this started, a clear, undeniable thought settled in my mind, quiet but impossible to ignore. I was no longer just involved, I was already inside it. The hallway felt too quiet, not silent but controlled, like every sound had been turned down just enough to make the absence noticeable. And I stood there exactly where I was, the phone still warm in my hand, my eyes moving without focusing, scanning faces that did not meet mine, movements that felt slightly delayed, like everyone was waiting for something they could not see, and I hated how aware I had become. How every small detail now carried weight it did not have before, because this was supposed to be a place I understood, a place where things made sense, where actions had reasons and outcomes followed patterns. But this did not follow any pattern I knew. This was something else, something quieter and far more precise, and the longer I stood there, the more that certainty settled in, heavy and unshakable, and then I saw it, not directly, not clearly, just a reflection in the glass of a nearby door, a figure standing at the far end of the corridor. Still, composed, not moving like someone passing through, but like someone who had already arrived, and my breath caught before I could stop it, because even without turning, even without seeing him clearly, I knew there was something unmistakable in the way the space adjusted around him. The way people instinctively shifted, creating distance without realizing why, and slowly, almost reluctantly, I turned, my heart beating faster now, not from fear, but from recognition, and there he was, exactly where the reflection had shone, standing beneath the harsh fluorescent lights like they belonged to him, like everything here did, his posture straight, composed, his presence cutting through the normal rhythm of the hospital without effort, and for a moment, everything else faded, the voices, the movement, the steady hum of machines, all of it dropping away until there was only the distance between us and the quiet certainty that he had crossed into my world without hesitation, and I should have been angry. I should have demanded answers, should have pushed back against whatever control this was becoming. But instead I just stood there, my fingers tightening slightly around the phone as he began to walk toward me, each step measured, unhurried, like he had all the time in the world, like he already knew how this would end. And when he stopped in front of me, closer than he had been the night before, close enough that I could see the details I had missed in the rain, the steadiness in his expression, the clarity in his eyes, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just that same quiet control that made everything else feel secondary. And for a second, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us in a way that did not feel empty, just full, like something important was about to be said. And then he broke it, his voice low, even, but carrying that same certainty that had followed me since the moment I met him. "I told you not to come." And I felt the words land before I processed them, felt the weight of them settle in my chest as I met his gaze without looking away. "You do not get to decide that," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt, because if I did not say it now, I was not sure I ever would. And something shifted in his expression, subtle but real, not anger, not surprise, just acknowledgement, like he had expected resistance but respected it anyway. And he studied me for a moment longer before speaking again, quieter this time, but somehow more intense. "You think this is about control," he said, his eyes holding mine with a focus that made everything else disappear again. It is not. And I swallowed, the words catching somewhere between understanding and refusal, because part of me knew he was right, knew this was something different, something deeper than simple authority or power, but that did not make it easier to accept. Then what is it about? I asked, the question coming out softer than I intended, and for the first time, something changed in the space between us, not in him, not in his posture or his tone, but in the way the moment felt, like it had shifted from something external to something personal, something that mattered in a way I was not prepared for. And he stepped just a fraction closer, not enough to invade, just enough to make his words impossible to ignore. It is about what happens when someone like you steps into something like this, he said, his voice steady, certain, like he had already seen the outcome, and my chest tightened at that, at the way he separated us into categories I did not fully understand, and I shook my head slightly, pushing back against it even as it settled deeper. I did not step into anything, I said, but even as I said it, I knew it was not true, knew that moment in the rain had been a choice. And he saw it too, I could tell by the way his gaze did not waver, did not soften, just held steady like he was waiting for me to catch up to something he already knew. And then he said it, quiet but final, a statement that landed with a certainty I could not ignore. You did. And the silence that followed felt different, heavier, like the moment before something irreversible. And as I stood there, looking at him, at the man who had found me in places he should not have been able to reach, I realized something I had been avoiding since the beginning. This was not about whether I had stepped into his world. It was about the fact that he had already stepped into mine, and he was not leaving. For a moment, I thought he was going to say something else, something that would explain everything in a way I could understand, something that would make this feel less like a decision already made and more like a conversation I was still part of, but he did not. He just stood there, watching me with that same steady focus, like he was waiting for me to reach a conclusion he had already accepted, and the silence stretched between us, heavy but not uncomfortable, just full of everything neither of us was saying. And I felt it then, clearer than before, that this was not about fear anymore, not in the way I understood it, because fear would have made me step back, would have made me create distance, would have made me walk away the moment he appeared at the end of that hallway. But I had not moved. I was still here, still standing in front of him, still choosing to stay even when every logical part of me knew I should not. And that realization settled deeper than anything else, because it meant this was not something being forced on me, not entirely. Part of it was a choice I was continuing to make, and I exhaled slowly, my grip loosening slightly on the phone as I met his gaze without hesitation this time. Then say it clearly, I said, my voice quieter but steadier than it had been all morning, because if this was going to change everything, I needed to hear it, needed to understand what I was stepping into instead of pretending I could ignore it, and something in his expression shifted again, not softer, not warmer, just more certain, like this was the moment he had been moving toward since the beginning. And he stepped just a fraction closer, enough that the distance between us felt intentional rather than accidental, enough that his words did not need to be loud to carry weight. You are not safe, he said simply, and the words landed without drama, without urgency, just quiet certainty, and I felt them settle in my chest, heavier than anything else. He had said, because there was no exaggeration in his tone, no attempt to convince, just fact, and I swallowed, my mind immediately trying to push back, to question, to find some version of this that fit into the world I knew. Because of you? I asked, not accusing, just needing clarity, and for the first time, he did not answer immediately, his gaze holding mine as if measuring how much truth I was ready to hear. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more deliberate, because you chose not to walk away. And something about that hit differently, not blame, not regret, just acknowledgement of a moment that could not be undone, and I looked down for a second, my thoughts catching on that, because he was right, everything traced back to that single decision, that single step forward instead of back, and when I looked up again, there was no point pretending I did not understand what he was saying. So what happens now? I asked, the question quieter than before, but more honest, and the answer came without hesitation, without pause, like it had already been decided long before I asked. Now I make sure nothing touches you. and my breath caught slightly at that, not because of the words themselves, but because of the way he said them, not as a promise, not as a favor, but as something inevitable, something that did not require my agreement to exist. And I felt that same tension rise again, that pull between resistance and something deeper, something I still could not fully name, because part of me wanted to reject it, wanted to insist that I did not need protection, that I could handle my own life without someone stepping in and deciding things for me. But another part of me, quieter but stronger, recognized the truth beneath it, recognized that this was not about taking something from me. It was about adding something I could not provide for myself, and I hated how much sense that made, hated how easily it slipped past my defenses, and I shook my head slightly, more out of instinct than conviction. "You cannot just decide that," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, they felt weaker than before, less certain, and he saw it. I could tell by the way his gaze did not waver, did not challenge, just held steady with that same quiet confidence that had followed me since the beginning. "I already did," he said, and there was no arrogance in it, no force, just truth, simple and unmovable. And the silence that followed was different this time, not heavy with uncertainty, but with understanding, because for the first time, I realized this was not something that was going to unfold slowly, not something I could step in and out of when it was convenient. This was a line that had already been crossed, a decision that had already been made. And as I stood there, looking at him, at the man who had turned one moment of kindness into something far bigger than I had ever intended, I felt it settle in completely, clear and undeniable. I could walk away from the fear, I could argue with the control, I could question every part of this. But one thing had already become certain in a way I could not change. He was not asking to protect me, he had already chosen to. And somewhere between the rain, the silence, and every step that followed, I had chosen not